On a Friday evening in February 2018, Julia Conway stopped by a rural Ontario farmhouse with a coffee for her boyfriend's grandmother. She expected a routine visit. Instead, she discovered 4 bodies and a scene that would haunt a small community forever. Welcome to True Crime Headquarters. Tonight, we explore some unsettling stories where appearances concealed something far darker. Take a moment to settle in. Breathe slowly. Let the outside world fade. This is the story of the Theoret family, when obsession turned to violence. Now let's begin. The community of Burk's Falls sits roughly 300 kilometers north of Toronto, nestled in the forested landscape of central Ontario. Population: fewer than 700 people. The kind of place where everyone knows their neighbors, where doors often remain unlocked, where trust is assumed rather than earned. It's a town built on that peculiar rural intimacy that comes from isolation, from shared winters and long summers, from generations of families putting down roots in the same soil. Ryerson Township, just outside Burk's Falls, embodies this character even more intensely. Properties sprawl across acres of land. Neighbors might be half a mile apart. In such spaces, people develop a particular relationship with solitude and with each other. If you enjoy listening and would like to find this channel again, you're welcome to subscribe. In the 1970s, Olavi and Raija Turunen purchased one such property on Starrett Road. The couple had emigrated from Finland, carrying with them the cultural touchstones of their homeland: a love of sauna, hearty meals, practical resilience. Over the years, they transformed the sprawling farm into something distinctly theirs. They built a new house. They constructed a sauna, that essential Finnish tradition. And they welcomed family and friends who helped with the labor, who gathered around Raija's kitchen table where a sign hung with characteristically straightforward Finnish humor. Today's menu: 2 options, take it or leave it. Their daughter Ola had moved to Michigan years earlier, where she'd married an American man named Steve and raised 3 sons: Thomas, Paul, and Hans. She worked as a nurse, a profession that suited her temperament. People who knew Ola described her as bubbly, social, someone who wore bright colors and loved to laugh. She was a caretaker by nature, both professionally and personally. The boys grew up with dual citizenship and dual influences. They spent summers in Canada, drawn to their grandparents' farm, to the expansive forest and lake country that surrounded Burk's Falls. When they reached college age, all 3 returned to Canada. Eventually, they took turns staying with their aging grandparents, helping maintain the property that was becoming too much for Olavi and Raija to manage alone. In 2014, Ola's marriage began to dissolve. She and Steve decided to move to Canada together to take over caregiving duties for her parents. But the relationship had run its course. Steve returned to Michigan. Ola chose to stay. She was 53 years old, newly single, living with her elderly parents in a small town where she'd spent summers but never truly lived as an adult. The divorce left her unsettled. Friends later described her as a little bit distraught, searching for connection and companionship in a place where her social circle was limited. Her brother Peter had died years earlier, but she still had connections to his old friend group. These were men who'd spent weekends at the Turunen farm in the 80s and 90s, hunting and fishing, helping with projects around the property. They'd become like extended family. Some still lived nearby. Juko Ojampara was in Huntsville. Armando Cabral made regular visits. And then there was Mark Jones, whom they called Jonesy back in the day. Mark Jones had been part of that circle once. He'd met Peter Turunen at George Brown College in Toronto at a Halloween party in the 1980s. Both men shared a passion for the outdoors. For years, Jones and the group spent nearly every weekend hunting or fishing, often at the Turunen cabin. He'd helped build parts of the farm, shared meals at Raija's table, become familiar with the rhythms of the property. But sometime in the early 90s, Jones drifted from the group. There were different accounts of why. Some of the friends worried about his diabetes management on remote hunting trips, far from medical help. They stopped inviting him along. Others remembered more specific incidents. Juko Ojampara recalled a duck hunting trip in 1994 when he emerged from the bushes to find Jones pointing a 12-gauge shotgun at him. The gun went off 3 times. Ojampara hit the ground. He was certain that if he'd been standing, he would have died. He cursed at Jones and told him he never wanted to see him again. Jones moved to Barrie, Ontario after that. He bought a fourplex, lived in one unit, rented out the others. He belonged to the Barrie Gun Club. He frequented a local machine shop. He kept to himself largely, a quiet, unremarkable existence. Then, around 2015 or early 2016, Jones began looking for property in the countryside. He'd been searching in Barry's Bay initially, but came across land in Burk's Falls, just down the road from his old stomping grounds, just down the road from the Turnen farm. He couldn't resist. Twice the land for half the price, he told acquaintances. He bought the property and moved in. At Olavi Turnen's 90th birthday party in the summer of 2016, Juko Ojampara made his way through the crowd of guests in the backyard. Then he stopped. Sitting in a lawn chair, smoking a cigar, was Mark Jones, the man he'd sworn never to see again. Jones grinned. Small world, eh? It was indeed a small world, and it was about to become smaller still. After Ola moved back to the farm, she and Jones began spending time together. She welcomed the company. She was social by nature, and her dating options in a town of 700 were limited. Her sons supported her desire to build a new social life. They wanted her to be happy after the difficult divorce, but it became clear quickly that Ola and Jones were not a good match. Their personalities clashed in fundamental ways. She was outgoing, dressed in colorful leggings and bright tops, filled rooms with laughter. He was controlling, rigid. He told her she should wear turtlenecks. She found him stifling. Her sons noticed her discomfort. "I never got a good feeling about him," Hans would later say. "And that's basically the way I described it to my mom." During a phone call in 2015, Thomas, who had moved to Taiwan to teach English, heard his mother mention casually that Jones had been leaving unsettling notes in the mailbox. The comment alarmed Thomas. It reminded him of a documentary he'd recently watched about domestic violence. He warned his mother to be careful, told her the whole family could be at risk. She never mentioned Jones to him again, but Jones remained present, lingering at the edges of their lives. He was handy with repairs, and Raija, who had known him for decades from the old days, continued to invite him over for card games. She liked him. She trusted him. Ola's reservations seemed less important to her mother than the practical help Jones provided around the aging farm. In 2016, Hans was at the house when Jones arrived for one of these card games. He was in the basement with his mother when they heard Jones's voice upstairs. Hans noticed his mother's immediate reaction. Her brow furrowed, her body tensed. She asked Hans to make sure Jones didn't come downstairs. Hans went up and confronted him. Jones asked why Ola hadn't come up to say hello. Hans told him to leave. That was the last time Hans saw Mark Jones alive. But avoiding him proved difficult in a town the size of Burk's Falls. On one occasion in 2017, Ola and a friend were at the local laundromat when Jones appeared. He started ranting, calling Ola degrading names. The laundromat owner later recalled how shaken Ola had been. A similar confrontation happened at a gas station while Ola was with a man she'd briefly dated. That same man later told Thomas that Ola had mentioned Jones's fascination with Olavi's gun collection in the basement, and that Jones had dry shot at her once with an unloaded gun, supposedly as a joke. Others in Burk's Falls witnessed fragments of this deteriorating dynamic. They saw confrontations, heard raised voices, noticed Ola's discomfort, but no one saw the complete picture. In small communities, there's often a reluctance to intervene in what appears to be a personal matter, especially when the parties involved have history. People don't want to overstep. They're afraid of being wrong, of making accusations they can't prove, of disrupting the delicate social fabric that holds small towns together. This reluctance to act carries particular risks in rural settings. Cell reception can be spotty. Internet access unreliable. The nearest police detachment might be 30 or 40 minutes away. Firearms are more common in rural households. And the very intimacy that defines small communities can become dangerous when someone needs help, because everyone knows everyone else. Victims may fear that reporting violence will expose them to judgment, gossip, or retaliation. Sharon Davis, who managed the nearest women's shelter to Berks Falls in Perry Sound, later noted that in rural communities like these, people struggle with how to respond to troubled relationships. They see pieces of concerning behavior but hesitate to assemble those pieces into a pattern. They tell themselves it's not their business. They hope things will resolve themselves. In the fall of 2017, those closest to Ola began to understand that the situation with Jones had escalated far beyond uncomfortable encounters. After a grocery shopping trip, Ola, Rija, Paul, and Julia Conway returned to the farmhouse to find Jones sitting alone in their kitchen in the dark. Paul and Julia were startled. Ola told them she'd handle it. They left her to speak with him and eventually heard him leave. Later that year, Julia found Ola outside by a bonfire, crying, holding a piece of paper. Another letter from Jones, she said. He'd been leaving notes in the mailbox again. But that wasn't the worst of it. Ola confided something even more disturbing. Jones had sexually assaulted her 2 years earlier, in 2015. It had happened in his car in the fields behind his house. He'd forced her to perform oral sex. She thought she was going to die. Ola threw the letter into the fire. She asked Julia to promise not to tell Paul or his brothers about the assault. She worried about how they'd react, what they might do. Julia promised to keep quiet. Other friends were keeping the same secret. Ola had told Juko Ojampara about the assault months earlier, in May of 2017 during a dinner party. But she'd made him promise not to tell her sons. He agreed, though he urged her to report it to police. I felt like going to his place and beating the crap out of him, he later admitted. But we had already had cocktails and a bottle of wine, so I was not going to be stupid. Probably it would have been the right thing to do after all. Life continued in its complicated way. Olavi was ill and would die in July of 2017. Ola was seeing someone new, a man from Florida she'd met at a Finnish banquet in Toronto. My life got easier and harder all at the same time, she wrote on Facebook that August. 2 weeks later, she posted from Florida, feeling happy, but the threat from Jones hadn't disappeared. It had only been temporarily submerged, waiting beneath the surface like something cold and patient. On a morning in September of 2017, Paul Van Dam was at his home when he saw Ola trudging toward him down the road in rubber boots. She needed his advice, she said. Then she told him about the sexual assault. Van Dam urged her to go to police. She hesitated, unsure. Look, he told her. You asked for my advice. I'm telling you to report this. Standing in Van Dam's living room on September 22, 2017, Ola made the call to the local Ontario Provincial Police Detachment. Van Dam drove her home so a detective could come by to meet with her. She went to the station the next day to provide a video statement. The officer asked why she was coming forward only now, more than 2 years after the assault. Ola explained that her father had recently died and she didn't feel safe anymore. In his report, the officer described her as agitated. What happened after that video statement remains unclear, locked behind privacy protections and police procedures that her sons would spend years trying to penetrate. Roughly 6 weeks after making her report, Ola stopped by Van Dam's house again. She looked relaxed, happy. She thanked him for his help and told him Jones wasn't bothering her anymore. Van Dam thought that was the end of it. He felt relieved for her. But a few months later, Van Dam was checking his mail when Jones's Subaru drove past. He caught a glimpse of Ola in the passenger seat. I thought to myself, I should go talk to her about that, Van Dam later said. But I never did. That's my big regret. What was happening between Ola and Jones during this period? Why was she in his car months after reporting him for sexual assault? The answers died with both of them. But the pattern suggests something familiar to anyone who studies violence between intimate or formerly intimate partners. the complexity of separation, the difficulty of completely severing ties in a small community, perhaps even coercion or threats that never made it into police reports. The month before she died, Ola checked herself into a hospital for 2 weeks. Thomas and Hans described it as a mental breakdown. They had no idea at the time about the sexual assault or the ongoing situation with Jones. They thought he was long gone from their mother's life. But Ola's medical records contained hints of what she was enduring. Mentions of an aggressive neighbor, concerns that police weren't helping her. She was struggling with depression, particularly since the divorce. She was trapped between her need for independence and her responsibility to care for her aging mother. She was navigating unwanted attention from a neighbor who seemed unable or unwilling to accept her rejection. And she was doing all of this in a place where help felt distant, where the nearest domestic violence resources were towns away, where even cell phone reception was unreliable. Around the same time, Joe Lazar, another neighbor on Start Road, began to notice something wrong with Mark Jones. The two men weren't close friends, but they were friendly enough to share the occasional dinner or watch sports together. In mid-February of 2018, Lazar's dog died. He asked Jones if he'd bring over his backhoe to help bury the animal. Jones's response was startling. He screamed, "How could you let her die?" Lazar knew Jones had been fond of the dog, but the reaction was disproportionate, frightening even. When confronted, Jones revealed that he'd been recently diagnosed with dementia. That explained some things, Lazar thought. Jones had recently gotten lost while hunting on his own property and had to call for help on his walkie-talkie. On another occasion, while helping with a fencing project, Lazar had noticed Jones becoming uncharacteristically confused. Lazar didn't know Ola at all. He knew little about Jones's relationship with her. Years earlier, Jones had mentioned seeing a girl down the road, but when Lazar ribbed him about it, Jones had told him curtly that it was over and he didn't want to talk about her. They never discussed it again. Around the time he revealed his dementia diagnosis, Jones began selling off his belongings. He'd had his driver's license revoked because of the diagnosis, he told Lazar. His own parents had struggled with dementia, and he said he wasn't going to go out like that. Lazar was alarmed. He knew Jones owned guns. He made a mental note to get his sister's phone number so he could call her, though he never followed through. He worried Jones might hurt himself. It never occurred to him that Jones might hurt other people. Looking back with the benefit and burden of hindsight, the warning signs seem obvious. Jones's increasingly erratic behavior, his obsessive attention to Ola despite her clear rejection, his access to firearms, his statements about not wanting to live with dementia, his isolation and deteriorating mental state, the previous incidents of dangerous behavior with guns, going back decades. But warning signs are only clear in retrospect. In the moment, they appear as isolated incidents, as quirks of personality, as private troubles that might resolve themselves. And in a small community, there's tremendous pressure not to make accusations you can't prove, not to be the person who causes unnecessary drama. Ontario's Domestic Violence Death Review Committee maintains a list of 41 risk factors that indicate potential lethality in cases of intimate partner violence. In the case of Ola Theoret and Mark Jones, numerous indicators were present. A victim who had an intuitive sense of fear of the perpetrator, obsessive behavior by the perpetrator, prior threats to commit suicide, sexual jealousy exhibited by the perpetrator, unemployment, access to firearms, and an escalation of violence. But Ola and Jones were not in a romantic relationship, at least not in the conventional sense that police and social services typically recognize. They'd spent time together. He'd wanted more than she was willing to give. She'd rejected him. He'd continued to pursue her, to harass her, to assault her. But because they'd never been officially a couple, their situation didn't fit neatly into the frameworks designed to identify and prevent intimate partner violence. This is the gap where people fall through, the space between acquaintance and intimate partner, the gray area where stalking behaviors emerge from former friendships or unrequited romantic interest. The kind of situation where a woman might not realize she's in danger until it's too late, where family might not understand the severity of the threat, where police might not have legal tools to intervene effectively. What did police do after Ola reported the sexual assault? The details remain sealed. Her son spent months, then years, trying to access information. They were provided with the video of her interview. Devastating to watch, they said, detailed and clearly conveying her fear. But many of their other requests were denied on privacy grounds. Even though Jones killed their family, they had no automatic right to know what investigative steps were taken. Was Jones interviewed about the allegation? Was his firearms license reviewed? Why was a man accused of a violent sexual assault able to retain weapons? If a doctor had revoked his driver's license due to dementia, why hadn't his firearms license been similarly affected? These questions would haunt the family for years. But in February of 2018, they remained unasked because Thomas and Hans didn't know they needed to ask them. On February 21st, 2018, Hans Theoret drove from Bracebridge, Ontario to take his mother out for a birthday lunch. They spent time together, talked, shared a meal. When he dropped her off afterward, he considered spending the night, as he often did. But he had work the next morning. He decided to drive back that evening instead. As he pulled away, he told his mother he loved her. At some point in the early morning hours of February 22nd, investigators would later believe it happened then. Mark Jones came to the farmhouse on Starrett Road. He parked his car at the foot of the long, curving driveway rather than pulling up to the house. He walked up carrying 2 firearms, a 12-gauge shotgun and a .40 caliber handgun. He entered the house, and then he ended 4 lives, including his own. The bodies remained undiscovered for approximately 48 hours. Paul Theoret, 28 years old. Ola Theoret, 55 years old. Rija Turunen, 88 years old. Mark Jones, 58 years old. 3 generations of one family, and the man who killed them. Julia Conway had a Friday routine. After her shift ended, she'd stop by her boyfriend's family home with a coffee for his grandmother, unless she'd given them advance notice that she had other plans. On February 23rd, she pulled up to the house at the end of the secluded cul-de-sac. It was 7:30 in the evening. The house was dark and quiet. The only sound besides the crunch of snow under her feet was the barking of the family dog, Lily. Julia figured everyone had called it an early night. She'd leave the coffee on Mummy's bedside table. First, she went to the basement to quiet the dog. Down the stairs, she found the white Chihuahua mix frantically pacing outside the bathroom doorway. Behind the dog, on the floor, lay Paul. At first, Julia thought he'd been sick. As she got closer, understanding came. He'd been shot. Her boyfriend was dead. She ran back upstairs. In one bedroom, Ola lay crumpled on the floor. In Mummy's room, 88-year-old Rija lay still in bed. They too had been shot. Fighting panic, Julia headed to the landline in the kitchen. Cell reception was spotty in the rural house. There, slumped in a chair at the kitchen table, was a 4th body. Male. His face unrecognizable from a gun blast. Tethered to the wall-mounted phone, she sat across from the body as she waited for help to arrive. For police to navigate the rural roads and find this house at the end of its winding driveway. "Don't look at him. Look at the ground," the dispatcher kept telling her. "Look at the ground." In the background, the family dog continued to bark, still at Paul's side in the basement. Julia felt nauseated, short of breath. Her head was spinning. As the minutes passed, realization came. She recognized the man in the chair. She'd seen him sitting in that exact spot before. It was their neighbor. It was Mark Jones. For months, trouble had been brewing on Starrett Road. Harassing letters, nasty confrontations, an allegation of sexual assault. Julia had known about Jones's dangerous obsession with Paul's mother, but she'd never imagined it would come to this. How do you imagine something like this? How do you anticipate that someone you know, someone who'd shared meals in this kitchen, would one day return and destroy an entire family? When police arrived at the scene, they found what Detective Inspector Martin Graham would later describe as the tragic scene. 3 members of one family, murdered. The suspected perpetrator, dead by his own hand. Firearms recovered. A community about to be shattered by incomprehensible violence. Obviously, the only people who know exactly what happened and why it happened are unable to speak, Graham told reporters in the aftermath. But that wasn't entirely true. The dead couldn't speak, but they'd left traces. Ola's police report, her medical records, her Facebook messages to friends, the witnesses who'd seen Jones's escalating behavior, the neighbors who'd noticed warning signs, the friends who'd kept secrets. All of these fragments contained pieces of the story, if anyone assembled them. As soon as Joe Lazar learned of the murders on Starrett Road, he froze. He knew instantly, he said later, that the killer was Mark Jones. Other neighbors had similar reactions. The crime stunned the community, but it didn't entirely surprise those who'd seen Jones's behavior in the months leading up to February 23rd. Armando Cabral, who'd been friends with both Ola and Jones since the 1980s, struggled to process what had happened. This wasn't his first experience with murder-suicide. In 2012, his own father had killed his mother and then himself. Armando Sr. and Leonilde had been 74 and 70, happily married for more than 40 years. But in the months before the murder, the elder Cabral had shown signs of mental illness, depression, auditory hallucinations. Then in 2015, Cabral's work partner, a Halton firefighter named Trevor McNally, killed his wife Sue and then himself. If you said to us that Mark was one day going to go out and murder a bunch of people and commit suicide, we'd be like, no, not ever in 100 years, Cabral later reflected. But people would have said that about my parents, too. Post-mortems confirmed that all 4 individuals died from gunshot wounds. The murders had occurred sometime between Wednesday evening and Friday evening when Julia discovered the bodies. The house had been a crime scene for 2 days before anyone knew. During that time, life in Berks Falls had continued as normal. People went to work. They stopped at the grocery store. They checked their mail. They had no idea that just down the road, for people lay dead, that a violence they could scarcely imagine had already occurred. News of the murders spread through Berks Falls the way news spreads in small towns. Quickly, incompletely, with a mixture of shock and the uncomfortable realization that everyone had known the people involved. Ola, the friendly nurse who'd returned from Michigan, her son Paul, her mother Rija, who'd lived on that farm for 40 years, and Mark Jones, the quiet handyman down the road who'd once been part of a friend group that spent weekends at the Turner cabin. Residents described the area as normally peaceful. 300 kilometers north of Toronto, near the Muskoka town of Huntsville, this was a place where people moved to escape urban violence, to find safety in space and solitude. The murders violated that fundamental assumption. If it could happen here, it could happen anywhere. But that conclusion, while understandable, misses something crucial. This didn't happen randomly. This wasn't an unpredictable explosion of violence. This was the culmination of a pattern that had been building for years. A pattern that was visible to multiple people but that no one had been able to interrupt. After the crime scene was processed and the house was cleared for the family, Armando Cabral spent weekends at the property helping Hans and Thomas sort through their family's belongings. He would catch himself staring at Rija's kitchen sign. Today's menu, 2 options, take it or leave it. Thinking back on the many meals he and Jones had shared there with the family. We solved the world's problems in that kitchen, he said, shaking his head. Down the road, Jones's house sat frozen in time. His belongings remained visible through the windows. No one came to claim them. No one cleaned out the property. It stood as a kind of monument to unfinished business, to a life that had ended in the worst way imaginable. It was only after the murders that Thomas and Hans learned their mother had reported a sexual assault to police. Thomas discovered a message she'd sent to a friend on Facebook after logging into her account. The discovery raised immediate questions. If police had known about the assault, what had they done to protect her? Had they interviewed Jones? Had they considered the risk he posed? Had anyone reviewed his firearms licenses? The brothers spent months trying to access information from the Ontario Provincial Police. In April of 2019, more than a year after the murders, they were provided with a video of Ola's interview with investigators. Thomas described watching it as devastating. His mother was detailed in her recounting. She was clearly scared. Her fear was evident, unmistakable. They requested additional documents related to the investigation. Many requests were denied on privacy grounds. "Even though he killed my family, I don't have any right to know anything about him," Thomas said. The statement captures a fundamental frustration experienced by many families in similar situations. The legal protections that apply to perpetrators' privacy often prevent victims' families from understanding what happened and whether anything could have been done differently. In August of 2019, the Ontario Coroner's Office confirmed that the case would be reviewed by the Domestic Violence Death Review Committee. The decision came after initial uncertainty about whether the case fit the committee's scope. The DVDRC typically reviews homicides committed by current or former intimate partners. But Ola and Jones had never been in a romantic relationship in the conventional sense. Their connection was more complex. Friendship circles, neighborly assistance, unrequited interest, rejection, obsession. Ultimately, the committee decided the circumstances warranted review. The decision gave Hans and Thomas some hope that they might get answers, that someone outside their immediate circle would examine what had happened and identify ways to prevent similar tragedies. Emily Groot, Regional Supervising Coroner for Ontario's North Region, explained that DVDRC reviews examine the history, circumstances, and conduct of perpetrators and victims. They look at community and systemic responses. They identify primary risk factors and possible points of intervention. They develop recommendations aimed at preventing similar future deaths. However, the DVDRC process is less public than a coroner's inquest. It provides only a snapshot of the information that would be available in an inquest. The coroner's office stated it would not be calling an inquest in this case, though families have the right to formally request one. The Theoret brothers believed an inquest would be valuable, but they were left navigating a system that often seems designed to protect institutions rather than illuminate failures. "It feels good to know that somebody, outside of the circle of people that have been dealing with it for the past year and a half, is going to look at this case," Hans said in 2019. "It's weird to say that something like that feels good, but it does." What would a comprehensive review reveal? Several failures stand out, even without access to confidential files. Jones's history of dangerous behavior with firearms, going back to the 1994 incident when he'd pointed a shotgun at Juko Ojampara. His deteriorating mental state, including a dementia diagnosis severe enough to revoke his driver's license. His access to weapons despite being accused of sexual assault. The apparent lack of follow-up after Ola's police report. The difficulty she faced getting help in a rural setting with limited resources and spotty communication infrastructure. But beyond specific systemic failures, there's a broader pattern worth examining. Multiple people knew pieces of what was happening. Julia Conway knew about the assault and Jones's obsession. Juko Ojampara knew about the assault. Paul Van Dam knew about it. Joe Lazar knew Jones was selling off his belongings and making concerning statements about not wanting to live with dementia. Various Berks Falls residents had witnessed harassing behavior at the laundromat and gas station. Yet these fragments never coalesced into a clear picture that prompted collective action. Each person who knew something thought someone else would handle it. Each person who witnessed something troubling assumed it wasn't their place to intervene. Each person who felt concerned didn't quite know what to do with that concern. This isn't about assigning blame to friends and neighbors. They were navigating a situation without clear guidelines, doing their best with incomplete information. But it illustrates a challenge that rural communities face particularly acutely. The same social cohesion that makes these places appealing can also make intervention more difficult. People fear disrupting relationships, making accusations that might be wrong, violating the unspoken rules of how neighbors should behave toward each other. Sharon Davis from the Perry Sound Women's Shelter noted that in 2017, the Domestic Violence Death Review Committee found it's not uncommon for friends, family, or coworkers to be aware of troubled relationships but not know how to respond constructively. "People don't want to get caught up in it," Davis explained. "People are really fearful of being wrong." The Theoret family filed a civil lawsuit against Jones's estate in the summer of 2018, seeking damages for loss of support, care, guidance, and companionship. The case worked its way through the courts slowly, as these things do. A sister of Mark Jones declined to speak with media when contacted. The Ontario Provincial Police, citing the ongoing civil litigation, declined to comment on specific aspects of the investigation. This was a tragic crime, and our hearts go out to the families and friends of the murdered victims and the community, spokesperson Carol Dion said. As the matter is before the courts, I am unable to provide further information. Thomas and Hans sold the family farm. They bought a house about an hour away where Hans now lives with Julia Conway and Lily, the dog who'd barked that entire terrible evening, trying to alert someone to the horror that had unfolded. Julia became like a sister to the brothers. She suffers from post-traumatic stress disorder and had not been cleared by her doctor to return to work as of 2019. Thomas went back to Taiwan, where he teaches English and works on memoirs about his loss. The brothers continue trying to get answers, to piece together exactly what happened and whether it could have been prevented. One morning in March of 2019, while Thomas was visiting, the three of them pulled out a box of items they'd retrieved from the house after the cleaning crew finished. Most photos and documents were loose. Their frames, splattered with blood, had been removed. They looked through old pictures. Paul in glamour shots from his brief modeling career, even appearing on the cover of Harlequin romance novels. Photos of all three brothers as kids in matching outfits with matching bowl cuts, playing at the farm while Raija and Olavi looked on proudly. Their parents' wedding album. A more recent shot of their mother with bright pink hair. She dyed it spontaneously shortly before she died. A classic Ola thing to do. I don't know what would give me closure. I really don't know, Hans said. I don't want to find out that somebody messed up, or that my mom could have handled it better, or that this guy was just a psycho that went off the rails. There's nothing at this point that could really make me feel better. But I want to help somebody in the future. Somehow, maybe, there's a way we can get the word out and help somebody. There are lessons here. For victims trying to navigate dangerous relationships. For family members who sense something is wrong but don't know how to help. For friends who know pieces of a troubling story but keep those pieces separate. For police responding to reports of assault or harassment. For medical professionals treating patients who mention threatening neighbors. For communities where everyone knows everyone and that very familiarity can become a barrier to seeking help. The statistics underscore the urgency. In 2018, roughly 150 women were murdered in Canada, almost all of them by men. In cases where a perpetrator was identified and their relationship to the victim was known, roughly 60% were killed by current or former intimate partners. Another 15% were killed by friends or acquaintances. In just over 10% of cases, the killer also killed himself. Ola Theoret's case wasn't unusual. It was emblematic. A woman trying to establish independence after divorce. A man unable to accept rejection. A small community where resources were scarce and distances were great. A system that didn't quite know how to classify or respond to a relationship that didn't fit standard categories. Warning signs visible but scattered. Fear present but not fully articulated. And then, in a matter of hours on a winter night, 3 generations of a family were gone. The farmhouse on Starrett Road eventually sold. New people live there now, people who have no connection to what happened in those rooms. Life continues. The town of Berks Falls continues. But for Hans and Thomas, for Julia, for everyone who loved Ola and Paul and Raija, February 23, 2018 remains a dividing line between before and after. What could have been different? It's impossible to say with certainty. Perhaps if police had taken more aggressive action after Ola's report. Perhaps if Jones's firearms licenses had been reviewed when his driver's license was revoked. Perhaps if friends had pushed harder instead of honoring her request to keep secrets. Perhaps if someone had assembled all those scattered warning signs into a coherent picture of danger. But perhaps offers no comfort to those left behind. What they're left with instead are questions. Memories. A box of photographs with the frames removed. A dog who survived. and a determination to ensure that Ola's death means something, that somehow her story might help others recognize danger before it's too late. In the end, this is a story about the difficulty of naming danger when it arrives slowly, about the particular vulnerabilities of rural communities, about the gaps in systems designed to protect people from violence, about the complexity of human relationships that don't fit neat categories, about obsession and rejection and the terrible things that can happen when someone refuses to accept boundaries. It's a story about Ola Theoret, who survived a difficult divorce and was trying to build a new life, about Paul, who'd modeled and moved home to help his family, about Rija, who'd emigrated from Finland and built a life on that farm, about Mark Jones, whose mental deterioration and obsessive fixation destroyed 4 lives, including his own. More than a year after the murders, the Berks Falls community was still processing what happened. In a town of fewer than 700 people, everyone knew the victims. Many had known the perpetrator. The violence shattered assumptions about safety, about knowing your neighbors, about the kinds of things that happen in places like this. The Ontario Domestic Violence Death Review Committee's examination, when completed, may provide recommendations. It may identify specific intervention points that were missed. It may suggest policy changes or training improvements. But no review can bring back 3 lives. No policy can undo what happened on Starrett Road. What remains is a responsibility to pay attention to patterns, to take threats seriously, to believe people when they say they're afraid, to act on warning signs even when action feels uncomfortable or uncertain. To understand that violence doesn't always announce itself dramatically. Sometimes it builds slowly, accumulating over years until it reaches a terrible culmination that, in hindsight, seems almost inevitable. Ola Theoret reported a sexual assault 6 months before she was killed. She'd told multiple friends about Jones's behavior. She'd sought help. She'd tried to protect herself. It wasn't enough. And that failure to protect a woman who'd identified her danger and asked for help is what haunts everyone left behind. On Starrett Road now, the houses stand as they always have. Trees line the rural road. Seasons change. Snow falls and melts. Spring brings new growth. The landscape remains beautiful and peaceful. But for those who remember, that peace will always contain an absence. 3 lives that should still be here. A family that should still exist. A future that was stolen one winter night by a man who couldn't accept that sometimes affection isn't returned. That sometimes people say no. That sometimes you have to let go. The story of the Theoret family is a tragedy. But it's also a call to action, to build better systems, to foster communities where asking for help doesn't feel impossible, to take reports of violence seriously, to believe victims, to act on warning signs even when doing so feels uncomfortable or uncertain. Because somewhere tonight, in a small town much like Berks Falls, someone is experiencing the early stages of a pattern that might end in violence. Someone is being harassed by a neighbor or former friend. Someone is afraid but unsure if their fear is justified. Someone is keeping secrets because they promise to, because they don't want to cause trouble, because they hope things will improve on their own. For those people, the story of what happened on Starrett Road offers a stark warning. Hope is not a strategy. Silence protects perpetrators more often than it protects victims. And by the time everyone realizes how serious the situation was, it may already be too late. The only way to honor Ola, Paul, and Rija is to learn from their deaths, to speak up when we see warning signs, to support people who are afraid, to push systems to do better, to understand that preventing violence requires all of us to pay attention, to care, and to act. Even when it's difficult, even when we're not certain, even when it would be easier to look away. That's the legacy Hans and Thomas are trying to build from incomprehensible loss. Not answers necessarily, because some questions have no satisfying answers, but awareness, recognition, a shared commitment to do better next time, to save the next family, to prevent the next February night when someone walks up a driveway with guns and ends 4 lives before anyone even knows to call for help. In the quiet darkness of a rural Ontario night, 4 people died. The question that remains is, how many more will die before we truly learn to see the danger that builds in plain sight? If you're new here, welcome to the channel, where we dive into true crime stories with calmness and respect. A special shout out to my amazing subscribers who've been with me from the start. Thank you for your incredible support. If you're still with me, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Or just say hello so I know you're still here. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and hit subscribe so you won't miss any of our upcoming true crime stories perfect for winding down. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. The Clutter Family Murders. On a quiet November night in 1959, a family of 4 went to sleep in their Kansas farmhouse, secure in the belief that locked doors were unnecessary. By dawn, their world had ended. What happened in those dark hours would expose something unsettling about the American dream itself, and the men who came hunting for it. There are certain crimes that reach beyond their immediate tragedy and somehow illuminate the darker corners of an entire era. The murder of the Clutter family in rural Kansas is one of those cases. It wasn't just the brutality of what happened that shocked a nation. It was the randomness, the senselessness, the fact that it could have been anyone. Tonight, we're going to walk through this story slowly, carefully, the way one might approach a house where the lights are on but nobody answers the door. We'll meet the people involved, understand the choices that led them to that farmhouse, and follow the investigation that would eventually bring 2 very different kinds of justice. This is a story about aspiration and desperation, about the distance between who we want to be and who we become when circumstances turn against us. It's also a story about a small town forced to confront the reality that evil doesn't announce itself. Sometimes it just knocks on the door. So settle in. Let's begin where all the best mysteries begin, with ordinary life, just before everything changes. Holcomb, Kansas, in 1959 was the kind of place people pointed to when they talked about the heartland. Wheat fields stretched to the horizon in every direction. Main Street had a post office, a few stores, a cafe where everyone knew your name. The population hovered around 270 souls, and most of them were connected by blood, marriage, or decades of shared Sunday dinners. The Clutter family wasn't just part of Holcomb. In many ways, they represented its highest aspirations. Herbert Clutter, known to everyone as Herb, was 48 years old that autumn, a prosperous farmer and respected community figure. He'd built his operation, River Valley Farm, into one of the most successful agricultural enterprises in western Kansas. The farm sprawled across more than 800 acres, and Herb managed it with the same methodical intelligence he applied to everything in his life. He was a man of routines and principles. He didn't drink alcohol or allow it in his home. He didn't smoke. He attended the Methodist Church every Sunday and served on the local school board, the Kansas State Board of Agriculture, and the Federal Farm Credit Board. People who knew him described a man of quiet authority, someone who led by example rather than volume. He had opinions, certainly, but he expressed them with a kind of measured thoughtfulness that made others listen. His wife, Bonnie, was 45, a gentle woman with artistic inclinations who played piano and had once been quite socially active. But in recent years, she'd struggled with what people at the time called nervous troubles, periods of depression and anxiety that sometimes kept her confined to her bedroom for days at a time. She'd sought treatment at various facilities and took medication, but the shadow never fully lifted. Those who knew her well spoke of her kindness, her creativity, and the sadness of watching someone so talented struggle against an invisible weight. The Clutters had 4 children. The 2 eldest, Beverly and Ivana, had already left home, started families of their own. That left 16-year-old Nancy and 15-year-old Kenyon still living at the farmhouse. Nancy was, by every account, exceptional. Straight-A student, class president, skilled musician, accomplished horsewoman. She taught Sunday school and 4-H classes. She baked pies for county fairs and won ribbons. She dated the son of the town's wealthiest family and seemed destined for a future that would take her far beyond Holcomb, though she loved the place deeply. Kenyon was quieter, more introspective. He built furniture in the basement workshop and read books about mechanics and engineering. He wasn't as outwardly charismatic as his sister, but he had his own steady intelligence, a curiosity about how things worked. Teachers saw potential in him, a mind that would sharpen with age and experience. The Clutter home reflected Herb's success without ostentation. It was a large, comfortable house, modern by the standards of rural Kansas. It had been designed with thought, built well. Each family member had their own space. Herb slept in a ground-floor bedroom near his office. Bonnie had a separate bedroom where she could retreat when her illness weighed too heavily. Nancy's room was upstairs, decorated in the style a teenage girl in 1959 might choose, neat, cheerful, personal. Kenyon's room was in the basement, near his workshop, where he could work on projects late into the evening without disturbing anyone. On the night of Friday, November 13th, 1959, life in the Clutter household followed its usual patterns. Nancy had been busy with typical teenage obligations, a music lesson, a 4-H meeting, time spent with friends. Kenyon worked on a project in the basement. Herb tended to farm business and correspondence. Bonnie remained in her room as she often did. Nancy's boyfriend, Bobby Rupp, came over that evening. They watched television for a while in the living room, talking about ordinary things, school, weekend plans, the small dramas of teenage life in a town where everyone knew everyone. Around 11 o'clock, Bobby left. Nancy walked him to the door. It was the last time anyone outside the family would see her alive. The house settled into nighttime quiet. Lights went off one by one. In a few hours, the sun would rise on what should have been an ordinary Saturday in November. But while the Clutters prepared for sleep, two men were already driving through the darkness toward them. Richard Eugene Hickok and Perry Edward Smith had met in the Kansas State Penitentiary, where both had served time for separate crimes. Dick Hickok was 28, a former high school athlete whose life had taken a series of bad turns after a car accident left him with subtle but permanent damage to his face and, some speculated, his judgment. He'd been married, had children, worked various jobs, but he'd also developed a taste for passing bad checks and petty theft. Prison hadn't reformed him. If anything, it had given him connections and ideas. Perry Smith was 31, shorter and more compact than Dick, with a childhood so brutal it seemed almost designed to create damage. His parents had been rodeo performers whose marriage collapsed in alcohol and violence. Perry and his siblings had been scattered through orphanages and foster homes, places where neglect and cruelty were routine. He'd been abused, humiliated, denied education. One institution had punished him so severely for bedwetting that it permanently damaged his legs, leaving him with chronic pain and a distinctive, slightly awkward gait. Despite everything, Perry had intelligence and sensitivity. He read constantly, taught himself music, kept journals, and drew pictures. He dreamed of finding treasure in Mexico, of becoming someone significant. But he'd also spent years drifting, merchant marine, army, various jobs that never lasted. He'd committed crimes, been caught, done time. He and Dick had become friends in prison, drawn together by some combination of circumstance and complementary damage. After their release, they'd stayed in touch. Dick was the talker, the planner, the one with schemes. Perry was the one who listened, who followed, who'd proven capable of violence when circumstances demanded it. Together, they formed one of those dangerous partnerships where individual weaknesses become collective momentum toward something terrible. Dick had heard a story in prison. A former cellmate named Floyd Wells had once worked for Herb Clutter and mentioned, in casual conversation, that the farmer kept large amounts of cash in a safe at his house. Wells had been wrong about this. Herb Clutter paid for everything by check and kept minimal cash at home, but Dick believed it completely. The story had taken root in his mind and grown into an obsession. He'd convinced Perry to join him. They'd steal Herb Clutter's money. Dick estimated it might be $10,000 or more, and then head to Mexico, where they'd disappear into new lives. It would be quick, clean, professional. They'd done crimes before. This would just be bigger, better planned. They'd spent weeks preparing in their haphazard way. Dick stole a 12-gauge shotgun from a friend's father. They gathered rope, tape, gloves, a hunting knife. They studied a map and planned their route. On the night of Friday, November 13th, they left Olathe, Kansas, in Dick's black Chevrolet sedan and drove west into the darkness, heading toward Holcomb. Neither of them had ever met Herb Clutter. Neither had any personal grievance against the family. This was just a job, Dick insisted. Business. They'd get the money and be gone before anyone even knew what happened. The distance between Olathe and Holcomb is roughly 400 miles. The drive took them through small towns that were already asleep, past farms dark against the night sky, through a landscape so vast and empty it seemed to swallow sound. They smoked cigarettes and talked about the future, about Mexico, about the money they'd have soon. The car's headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but road and the endless flat horizon. Somewhere around midnight, they reached the outskirts of Holcomb. Dick had gotten directions from Floyd Wells. He knew which roads to take, which turns to make. They drove slowly through the sleeping town, found the lane that led to River Valley Farm, and followed it to the house. Every light was off. The house sat silent and dark, a large rectangular shape against the starlit sky. Dick parked the car and turned off the engine. For a moment, they sat there, two men in a stolen vehicle with a loaded shotgun and a plan based on a rumor. Then they got out and walked toward the door. What happened next would take less than 6 hours, but its reverberations would echo for decades. Saturday morning arrived in Holcomb the way Saturday mornings always did, quiet, slow, suffused with the particular quality of light that comes with the end of harvest season. Nancy Clutter was supposed to teach a 4-H sewing class that morning. When she didn't show up, her students waited. Then they called. No one answered. One of Nancy's friends, Susan Kidwell, had planned to spend the day with her. When Nancy didn't arrive at the agreed time, Susan grew concerned. Nancy was reliable, punctual, the kind of person who called if plans changed. Susan asked her father to drive her out to the Clutter farm. They arrived around noon. The house looked normal from the outside. Cars were in their usual places. Nothing seemed disturbed. But when they knocked, no one came to the door. The doors were locked, which was slightly unusual. Many people in Holcomb didn't bother locking up, but not alarming on its own. Susan's father walked around the house, peering in windows. What he saw made him stop and look more carefully. Through one window, he could see into a room where things appeared disheveled. Not violently ransacked, but wrong somehow. Out of place. He went back to his car and called the county sheriff's office. The first officers arrived within 30 minutes. Sheriff's deputies, local law enforcement who knew the Clutters personally, who'd gone to church with them, whose children had been in classes with Nancy and Kenyon. They approached the house with no particular sense of urgency. Missing persons reports in small towns usually resolve themselves quickly. Someone had gone to visit relatives and forgotten to mention it. Car had broken down on a back road. But when they gained entry to the house, that assumption died immediately. Herbert Clutter was found in the basement furnace room. He'd been bound with rope, lying on a mattress box that had been placed on the floor. His mouth had been taped. He'd been shot in the head at close range with a shotgun. Kenyon was in the basement too, in the area near his workshop. He'd been bound and shot the same way. 15 years old, tied up and executed. Upstairs, they found Nancy. Her room showed signs of being disturbed, though not destroyed. She was still in her bed, on her back, bound at the wrists and ankles. She'd been shot in the side of her head. She was wearing a bathrobe over her nightgown, and someone had placed a blanket over her after she died. Bonnie Clutter was in her bedroom. Like the others, she'd been bound and gagged. She'd been shot once in the head. 4 members of the same family, systematically murdered in their own home while they slept. No signs of forced entry, no evidence of sexual assault, no obvious motive except that someone had clearly searched the house for something. The crime scene told a story, but it was fragmentary and confusing. Drawers had been opened, contents examined, but nothing seemed to be missing. The search appeared methodical in some ways, frantic in others. There were no fingerprints, the killers had worn gloves. There was little physical evidence at all, in fact, beyond the spent shotgun shells and the rope used to bind the victims. The Kansas Bureau of Investigation was called immediately. This was beyond the capacity of local law enforcement. Agents arrived by late afternoon, including Alvin Dewey, a veteran investigator who'd spent years with the KBI and had deep roots in the community. Dewey knew the Clutters. He'd visited their home, spoken with Herb about farm policy, met the children. Walking through that house, seeing what had been done to people he knew, would stay with him for the rest of his life. The investigation began with the usual questions. Who had grudges against the family? Who needed money desperately enough to kill for it? Were there any recent threats, strange visitors, unusual incidents? The answers kept coming back negative. Herb Clutter had no known enemies. His business dealings were transparent and fair. He didn't gamble, didn't drink, didn't keep questionable company. He was, by every account, exactly what he appeared to be, a successful, principled man who treated people well. Bonnie's illness had kept her isolated, but she had no conflicts with anyone. Nancy and Kenyon were teenagers. They had friends, minor social dramas, but nothing that could possibly explain what had happened. The randomness was the most terrifying aspect. If the Clutters, of all people, could be murdered in their beds, then no one was safe. The idea spread through Holcomb like a physical force. By Sunday, people who'd never locked their doors in their lives were installing deadbolts. Hardware stores in nearby towns ran out of locks, chains, and outdoor lights. The community tried to process what had happened through the rituals available to them. The Clutter children's schools canceled classes. Churches held special services. The local newspaper published a front-page story that struggled to find words adequate to the enormity of what had occurred. But beneath the public grief, fear was spreading. Because if this was random, if some unknown person or persons could simply choose a family and destroy it, then the foundations of small-town safety had crumbled. The idea of Holcomb as a place where terrible things didn't happen had died along with the Clutters. The investigation moved forward with increasing urgency. Agents conducted hundreds of interviews. They examined financial records, phone logs, travel records. They looked for patterns, connections, anything that might point toward a suspect. Bobby Rupp, Nancy's boyfriend, was questioned extensively. He'd been the last known person to see the family alive. But he had a solid alibi for the time of the murders. His family confirmed he'd been home by 11:30 and hadn't left again, and no possible motive. He was devastated, barely able to speak about what happened. The funeral took place on a cold Wednesday afternoon, for days after the murders. The church couldn't hold everyone who wanted to attend. People stood outside in the November wind, trying to comprehend how a service that should have been decades away was happening now, for an entire family at once. Meanwhile, the investigation was expanding beyond Holcomb. The methodical nature of the crime suggested experience. The fact that nothing of significant value had been taken suggested the killers had been looking for something specific and hadn't found it. The lack of evidence suggested planning and intelligence. Alvin Dewey and his team began looking at recently paroled criminals, particularly those with histories of burglary or violent crime. They ran down leads in neighboring states. They contacted the FBI. Tips poured in from all over Kansas and beyond, most of them well-intentioned but useless. Weeks passed with no significant progress. The case was developing a grim inevitability. Too much time passing, too little evidence, too many possible directions. Statistically, most murders are solved within the first 48 hours or not at all. The Clutter case was approaching the point where it might become one of those unsolved tragedies that haunted a community forever. Then, in mid-December, more than a month after the murders, a prison inmate named Floyd Wells read about the case in a newspaper and realized something that made him go cold. Wells had worked for Herb Clutter years ago. He'd mentioned the Clutters to his cellmate Dick Hickok, described the farm and the family. He'd told Dick, mistakenly, that Herb kept large amounts of cash in a safe at the house, and Dick had been released from prison just weeks before the murders. Wells sat in his cell and read the newspaper article again. The details matched what Dick had talked about: the isolation of the farm, the family structure, the timing. Floyd Wells had to decide whether to say something. Getting involved would make him a snitch, which carried its own dangers in prison. But for people were dead, and he might be one of only a few people who could point investigators in the right direction. He asked to speak with the prison warden. Within days, Kansas Bureau of Investigation agents were interviewing him in detail. Wells told them everything he remembered about his conversations with Dick Hickok. He described Dick's cellmate, a smaller man named Perry Smith who'd sometimes join their conversations. He gave physical descriptions, last known addresses, associates. It wasn't proof of anything, but it was the first solid lead the investigation had developed. Agents began tracking Richard Hickok and Perry Smith. They obtained photographs from prison records and distributed them to law enforcement across multiple states. They contacted parole officers, checked last known addresses, interviewed family members and acquaintances. What they discovered was telling. Both men had disappeared right around the time of the murders. Neither had stable addresses or employment. Both had talked about going to Mexico. Multiple people remembered Dick talking about a big score that would set him up for life. On December 22nd, agents learned that Dick had pawned items in Mexico City shortly after the murders. Mexican authorities were contacted. Border stations were alerted. An international manhunt was quietly underway. On December 30th, just over 6 weeks after the murders, Mexican police spotted 2 Americans matching the descriptions in a stolen car near the coastal town of Bahamar. They were arrested and held for questioning. Their names were Richard Hickok and Perry Smith. The extradition process moved quickly. Within days, Dick Hickok and Perry Smith were transported back to Kansas under heavy security. They'd been charged with minor offenses in Mexico, but Kansas authorities wanted them for something far more serious. Initial questioning yielded nothing. Both men denied any involvement in the Clutter murders. They'd been in Kansas at the time, they admitted, but nowhere near Holcomb. They'd been passing bad checks, committing petty crimes, but not murder. Never murder. Investigators had evidence, but it was circumstantial. Floyd Wells's testimony about Dick's interest in the Clutters. The timeline that placed both men in western Kansas on the night of the murders. The fact that they'd fled to Mexico immediately afterward. It built a compelling narrative, but without physical evidence or a confession, a conviction was far from certain. The breakthrough came through patience and psychology. Investigators separated the 2 men and began working them individually. They were housed in different facilities, given different information, subjected to different approaches. Perry was the more vulnerable of the 2. He was intelligent enough to know they were in serious trouble, sensitive enough to be bothered by what had happened, and conflicted enough about Dick that, under the right circumstances, he might talk. On January 6, 1960, after hours of careful questioning, Perry began to crack. He didn't confess directly at first. Instead, he started correcting the investigators' assumptions about what had happened that night. They had the basic facts wrong, he said. It hadn't gone the way they thought. The lead investigator, sensing an opening, asked Perry to tell them how it had really happened. Not because he was admitting anything, but just so the record would be accurate. Perry talked for hours. What emerged was a detailed account of the night of November 13th and the early morning hours of November 14th. He described driving to Holcomb with Dick, arriving at the house around midnight, entering through an unlocked side door. He described waking the family one by one, tying them up, searching the house for the safe that Dick insisted existed. They'd spent hours looking, growing increasingly frustrated. There was no safe. There was hardly any cash at all. The whole thing had been based on bad information, and now they were in a house with 4 bound witnesses who could identify them. Dick had wanted to leave, Perry said. Just tie them up securely and drive away. But they'd argued about it. If they left witnesses, they'd be caught within days. Dick had insurance convictions. He'd be looking at life in prison. They couldn't afford to leave anyone alive. Perry's account diverged from Dick's in crucial ways, particularly regarding who had actually pulled the trigger. Each blamed the other for the killings. Dick later claimed Perry had done all the shooting in a kind of frenzy. Perry maintained that Dick had killed at least 2 of the family members, including Herb and Kenyon, while Perry had killed the others. The truth was probably more collaborative than either wanted to admit. Both had been there. Both had participated. Both had made decisions that escalated the situation from robbery to murder. The physical details Perry provided matched the crime scene exactly. He described the layout of the house, the location of each victim, the type of tape and rope they'd used. He knew things that only someone who'd been there could know. Dick, confronted with Perry's confession, eventually admitted his involvement as well, though his version positioned himself as less directly responsible for the actual killings. The confessions were recorded, transcribed, signed. The legal process that followed was swift by modern standards but agonizing for everyone involved. Dick Hickok and Perry Smith were formally charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder in March of 1960. They were held without bail in the county jail. The trial began on March 22nd in Garden City, Kansas. The prosecution was led by the county attorney, a man determined to secure justice for one of the community's most respected families. The defense team faced an almost impossible task. Their clients had confessed, the evidence was overwhelming, and public sentiment was unanimous. The trial lasted only 2 weeks. Testimony from investigators, forensic experts, and Floyd Wells built an unshakable case. The confessions were entered into evidence. The defense attempted to argue that both men suffered from mental illness and diminished capacity, bringing in psychiatric experts to testify about their troubled backgrounds and psychological damage. Perry's childhood was laid out in detail. The abuse, the neglect, the violence he'd witnessed and experienced. Dick's head injury from the car accident was presented as potentially affecting his judgment. The defense wasn't trying to prove innocence. They were trying to save their clients from the death penalty. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. Both men were found guilty on all counts. The same jury then had to decide on sentencing, life in prison or death. Given the nature of the crime and the complete absence of mitigating factors beyond psychiatric testimony, the decision wasn't difficult for the jurors. Both Richard Hickok and Perry Smith were sentenced to death by hanging. The verdict was met with relief in Holcomb and the surrounding communities. Justice, in the most immediate sense, had been achieved. The men who murdered the Clutters would pay with their lives. But the legal process was far from over. Appeals are automatic in capital cases, and both men would spend years on death row while their attorneys challenged various aspects of the trial, the sentencing, and the legal framework around capital punishment itself. They were housed at the Kansas State Penitentiary in Lansing, in cells designated for condemned prisoners. The conditions were harsh, isolated, restricted, designed more for containment than rehabilitation. They had limited contact with each other or with other prisoners. Visits from family were rare and supervised. Perry continued to read, write, and draw. He maintained correspondence with various people, including a journalist named Truman Capote who'd become interested in the case. Dick remained more guarded, less willing to reflect on what had happened or engage with outside interest in their crimes. The appeals process ground on through the early and mid-1960s. Various motions were filed, hearings held, decisions rendered and challenged. The executions were stayed multiple times as legal questions wound their way through state and federal courts. During this period, Truman Capote conducted extensive interviews with both men as research for what would become his groundbreaking book, In Cold Blood. He visited them repeatedly, corresponded with them, particularly with Perry, and gradually assembled a comprehensive portrait of the crime and the men who committed it. The book was published in 1965 and became an immediate sensation. It was one of the first examples of what came to be called true crime narrative, presenting actual events with the techniques of literary fiction. It brought the Clutter case to national and international attention and sparked ongoing debates about crime, punishment, mental illness, and the nature of evil. But for the people of Holcomb, the book was something else. A reopening of wounds, a renewed public examination of the worst thing that had ever happened to their community. Some welcomed Capote's thorough, respectful treatment of the Clutters. Others felt the attention was invasive, that their grief had been transformed into entertainment. Through all of this, Dick Hickok and Perry Smith remained on death row, waiting. The legal appeals continued through 1965 and into 1966. Each time a court rejected their case, another avenue opened. Federal courts, constitutional challenges, psychiatric evaluations. The defense attorneys were doing their job, exhausting every possible argument to save their clients' lives. But gradually, the options dwindled. Courts at every level had examined the case and found no legal basis to overturn the convictions or the sentences. The trial had been fair. The evidence was overwhelming. The confessions were voluntary. The psychiatric testimony, while painting a picture of damaged men, didn't meet the legal threshold for insanity or diminished capacity at the time of the crimes. By early 1965, it became clear that the executions would likely proceed. The only remaining question was when. Truman Capote continued his visits during this period, a complicated presence in the lives of two condemned men. He was writing their story, immortalizing them in a way, but he was also waiting for them to die so he could finish his book. Perry, in particular, seemed to understand this dynamic and alternately resented and appreciated it. The final execution date was set for April 14, 1965, then postponed due to last-minute appeals. It was rescheduled for June 2nd, then postponed again. This pattern repeated multiple times, the psychological toll on everyone involved increasing with each delay. Finally, on April 14, 1965, exactly 5 years and 5 months after the murders, the Kansas Supreme Court denied the final appeal. No more stays would be granted. The executions would proceed. Richard Hickok and Perry Smith spent their final days in separate cells, visited by lawyers, a priest, and a handful of people they'd maintained contact with over the years. Neither showed much emotion. Both had spent so long under the sentence of death that its actual approach seemed almost anticlimactic. Perry wrote letters and drew pictures. Dick was quieter, more withdrawn. Both declined most offers for final statements or messages. In the early hours of April 14, 1965, they were prepared for execution. Kansas used hanging at that time, a method that was already becoming rare in America. The gallows were in a warehouse on the prison grounds, a grim piece of machinery that seemed to belong to an earlier century. Dick Hickok was executed first, just after midnight. He walked to the gallows without resistance, made a brief final statement acknowledging his crimes and expressing what might have been remorse, though his exact words were debated afterward. The execution was carried out according to protocol. He was pronounced dead within minutes. Perry Smith followed approximately 30 minutes later. He too walked calmly to the gallows. His final words were brief and directed at the witnesses. He expressed something between apology and explanation, though like Dick's statement, the precise meaning was interpreted differently by different people. The executions were witnessed by a group that included law enforcement officials, prosecutors, journalists, and a small number of citizens. Alvin Dewey, the lead investigator who'd spent years working the case, was there. Truman Capote was not. He'd left Kansas before the executions, unable or unwilling to watch the men die. News of the executions spread quickly through Kansas and beyond. Reactions were mixed. Many people, especially in Holcomb and the surrounding area, felt that justice had finally been fully served. The men who'd destroyed the Clutter family had paid the maximum price. Others questioned the value of executing them so long after the crimes, wondered whether anything constructive had been achieved by their deaths. In Holcomb itself, the reaction was more subdued than might be expected. 5.5 years had passed since the murders. The initial shock and fear had faded into something quieter, an ongoing sadness, a sense of permanent loss. The executions didn't change that. The Clutters were still gone. The town's innocence was still shattered. The case did bring changes, though some subtle and some profound. Law enforcement in Kansas and across the country studied the investigation as a model of how to work a difficult case with minimal physical evidence. The importance of following up on every lead, no matter how minor, was reinforced. The value of prison informants became more widely recognized, despite the ethical complications. The broader cultural impact was significant. Truman Capote's book became one of the best-selling nonfiction works of the decade. It was taught in schools, analyzed in universities, adapted into films and television projects. It helped create the entire genre of true crime narrative, with all the implications, positive and negative, that entails. The book also sparked ongoing debates about capital punishment, criminal psychology, and the roots of violence. Perry Smith, in particular, became a kind of case study, a person whose childhood trauma and abuse seemed to create an almost inevitable path toward violence, raising uncomfortable questions about culpability and societal responsibility. Some readers saw Perry as a victim who became a victimizer, a damaged person who never had a fair chance. Others saw him as someone who'd made clear choices despite his circumstances, who'd had opportunities for different paths and rejected them. Both perspectives had evidence to support them. Dick Hickok received less sympathetic treatment, perhaps because his background was less dramatically terrible, perhaps because his personality was less complex or compelling. He was often portrayed as the instigator, the one who corrupted Perry, though the reality was almost certainly more complicated. For the Clutter family's surviving members, Beverly and Ivana, the two daughters who'd already left home, the aftermath was quietly devastating. They'd lost their entire immediate family in one night. The public nature of the case meant they couldn't grieve privately. Every anniversary brought renewed media attention. Every adaptation of the story reopened the wound. The community of Holcomb tried to move forward. The Clutter house remained standing but changed hands several times. Most owners found living there difficult, haunted not by supernatural forces, but by history and association. It eventually became difficult to sell or rent at any price. River Valley Farm was sold and broken up. The agricultural operation that Herb Clutter had built so carefully was dismantled. The land returned to conventional farming, the innovative practices he championed gradually forgotten or absorbed into standard methods. The Methodist church where the Clutters had worshipped continued its services, but the space itself had changed meaning. The pews where the family had sat remained empty for years, a kind of unspoken memorial. Gradually, painfully, life in Holcomb resumed its rhythms. Children were born who had no direct memory of the murders. New families moved in. The town evolved the way all small towns do, shaped by economics and demographics and cultural shifts that had nothing to do with what happened one November night. But the case never completely faded. It remained part of the town's identity, mentioned in historical markers and tourism literature, referenced whenever anyone talked about Holcomb's history. The murder house became a kind of grim landmark, even after it was demolished decades later. Criminologists and psychologists continued to study the case, using it as an example in discussions about various topics. The psychology of partnership crime, the role of substance abuse in violence, the effects of childhood trauma, the mechanics of home invasion. Academic papers cited it regularly. It appeared in textbooks and case studies. The broader questions the case raised remained unresolved. Could the murders have been prevented? Should Floyd Wells have reported his suspicions earlier? Should parole systems have been structured differently? What responsibility did society bear for creating conditions that produced men like Perry Smith and Dick Hickok? There were no satisfying answers to these questions, just ongoing discussions that reflected broader cultural anxieties about crime, punishment, rehabilitation, and safety. One lasting impact was the change in rural communities' relationship with security. The idea that doors didn't need to be locked, that neighbors could be trusted automatically, that terrible crimes only happened in cities, those assumptions died with the Clutters. Small towns across America started locking doors, installing lights, thinking about vulnerability in ways they never had before. The case also influenced how crimes were investigated and reported. The thoroughness of the Kansas Bureau of Investigation's work became a model. The comprehensive crime scene documentation, the systematic interviewing of potential witnesses, the coordination between local and federal authorities, all became standard practices, studied and refined. Media coverage of crime changed too, partly due to In Cold Blood and the attention it generated. The idea that true crime could be serious literature, that criminal cases could be examined with psychological depth and narrative sophistication, opened new possibilities for journalism and nonfiction writing. Today, more than 6 decades later, the Clutter family murders remain one of the most analyzed crimes in American history. New generations discover the case through Capote's book, through documentaries, through academic study. The basic facts have been examined from every conceivable angle. Yet certain questions persist. What exactly happened in those hours between midnight and dawn? The confessions contradicted each other in crucial ways, and only two people knew the complete truth. Both are long dead, having taken those final details with them. Why did the situation escalate from robbery to murder? Was it panic or something darker? Was there a single decision point where a different choice might have saved the family? Or was the outcome inevitable once two armed men entered that house? And perhaps most fundamentally, was there any meaning to be extracted from such senseless violence? The Clutters hadn't done anything to deserve what happened to them. They were, by every measure, good people living good lives. Their murder illustrated nothing except that random evil exists and that safety is an illusion more fragile than anyone wants to believe. The case offers no comforting conclusions. It doesn't reveal that justice always prevails or that the system works perfectly. The Clutters are still dead. The community was permanently changed. Dick Hickok and Perry Smith were executed, but their deaths didn't undo anything or provide real closure. What remains is the story itself. A narrative of ordinary people and the night when extraordinary violence found them. It's a reminder that tragedy doesn't always announce itself, that evil sometimes wears the face of two drifters in a black Chevrolet who knock on the wrong door looking for money that doesn't exist. The people of Holcomb learned to live with what happened, the way communities do after trauma. They raised children and planted crops and went to church and gradually built new memories that eventually outnumbered the terrible ones. But they never forgot. How could they? November nights in Kansas are cold and quiet, stars scattered across an enormous sky, farmhouses glowing like islands in an ocean of darkness. It looks peaceful, even beautiful, and mostly it is. But for anyone who knows the story, there's always a shadow in that landscape now. A reminder of the night when peace was shattered and 4 lives ended for no reason anyone could ever fully understand or accept. The Clutter family murders remain, ultimately, a story about vulnerability and randomness, about the thin line between safety and catastrophe. It's a story that refuses to offer easy lessons or comfortable conclusions. And maybe that's the most unsettling thing about it. Not the violence itself, but the reminder that sometimes there is no deeper meaning, no hidden reason, no way to make sense of senseless acts. Just the facts, stark and terrible, and the question we're left with: what do we do with a story that offers no resolution except the knowledge that the worst can happen, has happened, and might happen again? The answer, perhaps, is simply to remember, to honor the victims by telling their story honestly, to acknowledge the tragedy without sensationalizing it, and to live as fully as possible while understanding that safety is precious precisely because it's never guaranteed. The Clutters understood that, though they couldn't have known how their lives would demonstrate it, they lived with purpose and kindness. They built something meaningful in their corner of Kansas. They raised children and contributed to their community and believed in tomorrow. That their lives ended so brutally doesn't erase what they built. It makes it more poignant, more valuable, more worth remembering. And so we remember them, Herb and Bonnie, Nancy and Kenyon, not just as victims of a famous crime, but as real people who lived and loved and mattered, whose lives had meaning beyond the terrible way they ended. Their story is finished now, told and retold countless times, examined from every angle. But the questions it raises remain alive, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable, lingering in the darkness like the lights of a farmhouse seen from a long distance on a cold November night. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story to help you drift off to sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. The Gregory Villemin Case. On an October evening in 1984, A 4-year-old boy disappeared from his front yard in a quiet French village. 2 hours later, his body was found in a freezing river, hands and feet bound. But this wasn't a stranger's crime. Someone close to the family had been watching, waiting, and tormenting them for months. The calls had promised this exact moment. And when it happened, it tore apart not just one family, but an entire community. This is the story of little Gregory, the letters that predicted his death, and the question that still haunts France today: who really killed him? Close your eyes and let me take you to the Vosges Mountains in eastern France, where the forests are dense and the winters are long. It's a place where everyone knows everyone, where families have lived for generations, where secrets don't stay buried for long. This is a story that gripped an entire nation, a mystery so complex that it's been called France's most infamous unsolved case. But tonight we're going to walk through it together, step by step, examining every detail, every phone call, every letter, and every heartbreaking turn. This isn't just about a crime. It's about jealousy that festered in silence, about a family tree twisted with resentment, and about how the people you trust most can sometimes be the ones you should fear. So settle in, get comfortable, and let me tell you about the boy whose death changed French criminal justice forever. The village of Lepangy-sur-Vallon sits nestled in the Vosges region, a place of rolling hills and thick pine forests where morning mist clings to the valleys. In 1984, it was home to about 2,000 people, most of them working-class families connected through generations of shared history. The textile factories that once thrived there had begun to close, leaving behind a community that held tight to tradition and family ties. Jean-Marie Villemin was 26 years old, a foreman at a local factory. He'd done well for himself, better than most in his family, and he wasn't shy about it. He drove a nice car, owned a comfortable home, and provided well for his wife Christine and their son, Gregory. The boy had just turned for that October, a bright-eyed child with his whole life ahead of him. To anyone looking in from the outside, the Villemins seemed blessed, perhaps even enviable. But envy, as we know, can be a poison that works slowly. It started with phone calls, anonymous, menacing calls that came at odd hours. A man's voice, disguised and muffled, would speak in riddles and threats. He seemed to know intimate details about Jean-Marie's life, his schedule, his successes. The caller took particular interest in Gregory, mentioning the boy by name, describing what he was wearing, what he was doing. These weren't random acts of harassment. They were calculated, personal, deliberate. The calls had been coming for months before October. Jean-Marie tried to brush them off at first, tried to convince himself they were pranks, nothing serious. But they continued, week after week, always from different phone booths scattered across the region. The voice would taunt him about his job, his money, his happiness. "You think you're better than everyone else," the voice would say. "You think you're so successful. But I'm going to make you pay." Then came the letters. Written in careful block letters, they echoed the same themes as the phone calls. The writer called himself the Crow, a reference that carried weight in French culture, where crows symbolize ill omens and death. The Crow knew everything about the Villemin family. He knew when Jean-Marie got a promotion. He knew when they bought new furniture. He knew Gregory's daily routine down to the minute. What made this particularly disturbing was the familiarity. This wasn't someone observing from a distance. This was someone close, someone who had access to family conversations, someone who understood the dynamics and relationships within the Villemin clan. And the Villemin family was large and complicated, a web of brothers, cousins, uncles, and in-laws, many of whom lived within a few miles of each other. Jean-Marie came from a family of 5 children. His father, also named Jean-Marie, was a stern man who'd worked hard all his life and expected the same from his sons. But not all the brothers had thrived equally. Some struggled with work, with money, with the feeling that life had passed them over. Family gatherings, which should have been joyful, often carried an undercurrent of tension. Success in one branch of the family meant comparison and sometimes resentment in another. Christine, Gregory's mother, was 25, a devoted parent who spent her days caring for her son. She'd noticed the calls too, heard the menace in that disguised voice. She'd seen Jean-Marie's face tighten with worry, watched him try to hide his fear. They'd reported the harassment to police, but in a small community where everyone was related to everyone else, the investigation moved slowly. The gendarmes took statements, traced some of the calls to public phones, but they had no clear suspect, no way to identify a voice that was deliberately masked. As autumn deepened and the days grew shorter, the threats escalated. The Crow's letters became more specific, more violent in their implications. He talked about taking away what Jean-Marie loved most. He talked about making the family suffer, about bringing them down to the level where they belonged. Looking back now, the warnings were chillingly clear. But at the time, Jean-Marie and Christine tried to maintain normalcy for Gregory's sake. They couldn't let fear rule their lives. October 16th, 1984, was a Tuesday. The morning passed like any other. Christine kept Gregory close, as she always did when Jean-Marie was at work. The boy played in their yard, a small patch of grass behind their house that faced the Valone River. It was just before 5 in the evening when Christine stepped inside for a moment, just a minute or two to check on something in the kitchen. When she came back out, Gregory was gone. She called his name. No answer. She checked the garden, the street, the neighbors' yards. Nothing. Panic set in quickly. She called Jean-Marie at work. He left immediately, racing home through the darkening evening. They searched everywhere, calling for Gregory, knocking on doors, their voices growing more desperate with each passing minute. At 6:45 that evening, Jean-Marie's phone rang. It was the voice, the Crow. He spoke clearly this time, without much disguise, confident and cold. "I've taken the boy," he said. "You'll find him in the river. I've had my revenge." Then the line went dead. Jean-Marie's world collapsed in that moment. He called the police, then drove to the Valone River, his hands shaking on the wheel. Other family members and neighbors joined the search, spreading out along the riverbanks in the darkness. Flashlights swept across the cold water, illuminating nothing but the steady current and the overhanging branches. It was just after 9 that evening when they found him. Gregory's small body was floating in the river about 6 miles from his home, near the village of Docelles. His hands and feet were bound with cord. His woolen hat was still pulled down over his head. He'd been dead for several hours, drowned or suffocated before being placed in the water. The medical examiner would later determine that he died relatively quickly, a small mercy in a story filled with horror. The news spread through the Vosges like wildfire. A child murdered, taken from his own yard in broad daylight, killed by someone who'd been threatening his family for months. The phone calls and letters, which police had treated as harassment, suddenly became evidence of premeditated murder. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. This was something planned, something personal, something that had been building for a long time. France reacted with shock and fury. The case dominated television news and newspaper headlines. Politicians demanded action. The public wanted answers. And the investigation, which should have moved swiftly and decisively, instead became one of the most chaotic and controversial in French legal history. The morning after Gregory's body was found, the village of Lapangis-sur-Valone woke to a nightmare. Television crews descended on the quiet streets. Journalists knocked on doors, seeking interviews, trying to understand how such a thing could happen in a place where crime was almost unheard of. The Villemin family, shattered by grief, tried to maintain dignity in the face of unimaginable loss. The investigation began in earnest, led by Judge Lambert, a magistrate who'd never handled a case of this magnitude. French law operates differently from the American system. An investigating judge controls the investigation, directing police work and deciding which paths to pursue. Judge Lambert was young, ambitious, and quickly overwhelmed by the complexity of what he faced. The first question was obvious. Who was the Crow? The letters and phone calls provided a wealth of evidence, but also confusion. Handwriting experts examined the letters. Voice analysts studied recordings of the calls. The consensus was that the Crow was likely male, probably someone with a basic education, definitely someone local. The references in the letters were too specific, too intimate to come from an outsider. Police compiled a list of everyone connected to the Vilman family. Brothers, cousins, uncles, neighbors, co-workers. In a place as tightly knit as the Vosges, that meant dozens of potential suspects, each with their own complicated relationships to Jean-Marie and Christine. Investigators conducted hundreds of interviews, taking statements, looking for inconsistencies, searching for anyone who might have a motive. Jealousy emerged as the primary theory. Jean-Marie had done well financially, and not everyone in the family was happy about it. His younger brother Michel had struggled with work and money. His cousin Bernard had a reputation for being difficult, prone to anger and resentment. Several family members had made comments over the years about Jean-Marie's success, snide remarks about his car or his house, the kind of casual cruelty that festers in families. Then there was Bernard Laroche, Jean-Marie's cousin by marriage. Bernard was 32, married with a young son of his own. He lived about 15 minutes from the Villemans, worked odd jobs, and had a history of conflict with various family members. Several people mentioned his name to police, noting that he'd seemed particularly interested in Gregory, that he'd made strange comments about the boy. Bernard's wife, Marie-Ange, was Jean-Marie's cousin, which meant family gatherings often threw the two men together. On November 5, 1984, less than 3 weeks after Gregory's murder, Judge Lambert made a dramatic decision. Based on circumstantial evidence and witness statements, he ordered the arrest of Bernard Laroche. The evidence was thin, mostly relying on the testimony of Bernard's sister-in-law, Muriel Ball, a 15-year-old girl who claimed she'd been with Bernard on the day of the murder and had seen him with Gregory. Muriel's story was explosive. She said Bernard had picked her up after school that Tuesday afternoon. They'd driven around, and at some point, she'd seen Gregory in the car, frightened and crying. She said Bernard had driven to the Valone River and made her wait in the car while he did something by the water. She was vague on details, clearly traumatized, but her statement gave investigators what they needed to bring charges. Bernard Laroche maintained his innocence from the beginning. He had an alibi, he said. He'd been at work, then home with his wife. He'd never gone near Gregory. He didn't know anything about the murder, but Muriel's testimony carried weight, and Judge Lambert believed they had their man. The arrest should have brought relief, but instead it deepened the divisions within the Vilman family. Some believed Bernard was guilty, pointing to his strange behavior and his jealousy of Jean-Marie's success. Others defended him, saying he was being scapegoat, that Muriel was lying or confused. The family split into factions, no longer able to gather for holidays or celebrations without tension and accusation. Jean-Marie and Christine, meanwhile, struggled with grief and anger. They'd lost their only child in the most brutal way imaginable. They'd been terrorized for months before his death, and now they had to trust a justice system that seemed slow and uncertain. Jean-Marie gave interviews to the press, his face haggard, his voice breaking as he talked about Gregory. Christine withdrew, barely able to function under the weight of her loss. Then, in February 1985, everything fell apart. Muriel Ball recanted her testimony. She said police had pressured her, that she'd been scared and confused, that she'd made up the story about seeing Gregory in Bernard's car. She admitted she'd been with Bernard that day, but only for a short time, and she'd seen nothing related to the murder. Without her testimony, the case against Bernard collapsed. Judge Lambert had no choice. In early February, Bernard Laroche was released from prison. The Vilman family was devastated. Jean-Marie couldn't accept that the man he believed killed his son was now free. The rage that had been building inside him since October reached a breaking point. On March 29, 1985, Jean-Marie took a rifle, drove to Bernard Laroche's home, and shot him dead in front of witnesses. It was an execution, plain and simple, carried out in broad daylight by a father who'd lost faith in justice. Jean-Marie was immediately arrested and charged with murder. He never denied what he'd done. He said he'd killed the man who murdered Gregory, that he'd done what needed to be done. The case, already sensational, now became something even more complex. The victim's father was now a killer. The The investigation into Gregory's death was now tangled with Jean-Marie's trial for murder. But even as Jean-Marie sat in prison awaiting trial, the investigation into Gregory's murder continued, and it was about to take another shocking turn, one that would push Christine Villemin into the darkest chapter of her life. The spring of 1985 brought no peace to the Vosges. Bernard Laroche was dead, killed by Jean-Marie in an act of vengeance that divided public opinion. Some saw Jean-Marie as a grieving father driven to extremes by a failed justice system. Others saw a murderer who'd taken the law into his own hands. The media circus intensified, with television crews permanently stationed in Lapangis-sur-Valognes, turning the quiet village into a stage for national drama. Judge Lambert, under enormous pressure and criticism for his handling of the case, began to re-examine every aspect of the investigation. He'd been wrong about Bernard Laroche, that much was clear. So who had really killed Gregory? And who was the Crow? Were they the same person? Or had two separate individuals been tormenting the Villemin family? The letters continued even after Gregory's death, even after Bernard's arrest and release. The Crow seemed to take pleasure in the chaos, in the family's suffering. New letters arrived, mocking the investigation, claiming credit for the murder, hinting at insider knowledge that only someone very close to the family could possess. Handwriting experts were brought back in, asked to compare new samples with old ones, looking for matches among family members. In July 1985, Judge Lambert made a decision that shocked France. Based on new handwriting analysis, he accused Christine Villemin of murdering her own son. The theory was almost incomprehensible. Experts claimed that the letters, or at least some of them, had been written by a woman. They said Christine's handwriting, when disguised, matched certain characteristics in the Crow's letters. Judge Lambert theorized that Christine had been suffering from severe psychological distress, possibly postpartum depression that had never resolved, and had harmed Gregory in a moment of madness. Christine was arrested on July 5, 1985. The image of her being led away in handcuffs, her face pale and bewildered, became one of the defining photographs of the case. Jean-Marie, still in prison himself for Bernard's murder, was beside himself. He'd lost his son, killed a man he believed guilty, and now his wife was being accused of the very crime that had destroyed their lives. The public reaction was fierce and divided. Some believed Judge Lambert had finally found the truth, that Christine's grief and odd behavior in interviews had always seemed suspicious. Others saw a gross miscarriage of justice, a desperate investigator throwing accusations at anyone to save his reputation. Women's groups rallied to Christine's defense, arguing that she was being scapegoated because the investigation had failed so spectacularly to find the real killer. Christine spent several weeks in custody before being released on bail. The handwriting evidence was questionable at best. Different experts gave different opinions, and none of it was conclusive. More importantly, there was no physical evidence linking Christine to Gregory's death. No witness had seen her near the river. No one could place her away from home during the crucial time period. And the idea that a mother would bind her own 4-year-old child's hands and feet and drown him defied all psychological profiling. The charges against Christine were eventually dropped, but the damage was done. She'd been publicly accused of murdering her son, an accusation that would follow her for the rest of her life. The investigation had now accused and released 2 people, destroyed the credibility of Judge Lambert, and brought the French justice system under intense scrutiny and criticism. Judge Lambert was eventually removed from the case in 1985, replaced by Judge Simon, who inherited a complete disaster. The evidence had been contaminated by leaks to the press. Key witnesses had changed their stories multiple times. The family was traumatized and fragmented beyond repair. And the core questions remained unanswered. Who killed Gregory Villemin? And who was the Crow? Jean-Marie's trial for the murder of Bernard Laroche took place in 1988. He was convicted and given a 5-year suspended sentence, essentially time served. The court acknowledged the extraordinary circumstances, the psychological torture he'd endured, the failure of the justice system to protect his family. He walked free, but he walked into a life forever marked by loss and violence. Christine and Jean-Marie tried to rebuild. They had another child, a son they tried to raise away from the shadow of Gregory's death. But the case never really ended for them. Every few years, new investigators would reopen the file, examine old evidence with new technology, follow new leads that ultimately went nowhere. The Crow's identity remained a mystery, a ghost that haunted not just the Vilman family but an entire nation. In the years that followed, various theories emerged. Some investigators believed Bernard Laroche had been guilty after all, that Muriel Ball's original statement was true and her recantation had been coerced by family pressure. Others looked at different family members, at cousins and uncles who had financial or personal grudges. Some even theorized that the Crow and Gregory's killer were two different people, that the harassment campaign and the murder were unconnected except by terrible timing. The advancement of DNA technology in the 1990s brought new hope. Evidence from Gregory's clothing, from the cords used to bind him, from the letters, was tested and retested. But the results were inconclusive or contaminated by decades of handling. The investigation had been so chaotic in the early days that crucial evidence had been compromised, making modern analysis difficult or impossible. More than 40 years have passed since that October evening when Gregory Vilman disappeared from his yard. The case has become part of French cultural memory, referenced in books, documentaries, television series. It's taught in law schools as an example of how investigations can go catastrophically wrong. It's discussed in psychology courses as a study in family dynamics and the corrosive power of jealousy. In 2017, police made arrests that briefly revived hope for resolution. Based on new DNA analysis of one of the Crow's letters, investigators detained 3 members of the extended Vilman family, including Marcel Jacob, Jean-Marie's uncle, and Marcel's wife Jacqueline. The theory was that Marcel had been the Crow, conducting the harassment campaign out of jealousy and resentment toward his nephew's success. But the DNA evidence was questionable, and after months of investigation, no charges were filed. Muriel Ball, the teenage witness whose testimony and recantation had proved so pivotal, was also questioned again in 2017. By then she was in her late 40s, a grown woman with her own children, still haunted by her role in the case. She gave yet another version of events, saying she had seen something that day but had been too frightened to tell the truth. Her credibility, after so many conflicting statements, was impossible to assess. The arrests were eventually dropped, the investigation once again reaching a dead end. But it opened old wounds, brought the families back into conflict, reminded everyone involved that the case would never truly be closed unless the truth emerged. And the truth seemed as elusive as ever. Jean-Marie and Christine Vilman still live in eastern France, though not in Lapangis-sur-Valognes. They've spent decades trying to find peace, trying to honor Gregory's memory while moving forward with their lives. They've given occasional interviews over the years, always measured, always careful, always carrying the weight of what happened. In their eyes, you can see the toll that 4 decades of uncertainty has taken, the exhaustion of living with questions that have no answers. The village of Lapangis-sur-Valognes has changed. The factories that once defined it are mostly gone. New families have moved in, people with no connection to the events of 1984. But the old-timers remember. They remember the media trucks, the police raids, the way neighbors stopped trusting each other. The case tore through their community like a storm, and some of the damage was never repaired. One of the most haunting aspects of the Gregory Vilman case is how it reveals the fragility of families and communities. This was not a random crime committed by a stranger. This was something that grew from within, from jealousy and resentment that festered over years. Someone who knew Gregory, who had perhaps watched him play, who had sat at the same dinner table with him, took his life. That betrayal, that intimacy of the crime, makes it particularly disturbing. The Crow's letters, still stored in evidence lockers somewhere in France, represent a psychological portrait of obsession. Whoever wrote them devoted enormous time and energy to tormenting Jean-Marie Vilman. The planning, the surveillance, the carefully crafted messages. It all speaks to someone consumed by envy, someone who couldn't bear to see another family member succeed. In that sense, the letters are as much a part of the tragedy as the murder itself. Over the years, various journalists and investigators have developed their own theories. Some remain convinced that Bernard Laroche was guilty, that Muriel Ball told the truth the first time and was later pressured to recant by family members who wanted to protect Bernard. They point to his behavior, his opportunity, his connection to the family tensions. But Bernard can never defend himself or confess, because Jean-Marie killed him before the truth could emerge. Others believe the answer lies elsewhere in the extended family, in one of the cousins or uncles who lived nearby and had access to family information. The DNA evidence from 2017 pointed in this direction, though not conclusively. Some investigators have suggested that the Crow might have been one person while Gregory's killer was another, that two separate crimes intersected in the worst possible way. There's also the uncomfortable possibility that the case will never be solved, that too much time has passed, too much evidence has been lost or contaminated, too many witnesses have died or become unreliable. French law has no statute of limitations on murder, so theoretically the case remains open. But with each passing year, the likelihood of a resolution diminishes. The legacy of Gregory Villemin extends beyond his own story. The case led to significant reforms in French criminal procedure, changes in how investigating judges work with police, improvements in evidence handling and media relations. It exposed the dangers of rushing to judgment, of making arrests without solid evidence, of letting public pressure drive investigative decisions. In that sense, Gregory's death, while tragic, contributed to a better justice system for future cases. But for those of us who study true crime, who examine these cases trying to understand human nature at its darkest, the Gregory Villemin case offers something more than lessons in procedure. It shows us how jealousy can poison families, how success in one quarter can breed resentment in another, how the people we trust most can sometimes harbor the deepest grudges. It reminds us that evil doesn't always come from strangers in the night. Sometimes it comes from someone at the dinner table, someone who knows your routine, someone who's been watching and waiting, nursing grievances that grow like tumors until they metastasize into something unspeakable. On quiet evenings in the Vosges, when mist rises from the Valognes River and settles over the villages, people still talk about Gregory. Parents hold their children a little closer. Families eye each other with a wariness that wasn't there before. The case changed something fundamental in how that community sees itself, introduced a darkness that had always been possible but never realized until that October day in 1984. Gregory would be in his mid-40s now if he'd lived, perhaps with children of his own. A life that should have unfolded in all its ordinary beauty. Instead, he became a symbol, a name that represents unsolved mysteries and shattered families. His photograph, that sweet 4-year-old face, appears in every documentary and article about the case, frozen in time, never aging, never knowing what came after. The truth about who killed Gregory Villemin might be locked in someone's conscience, a secret carried through decades, a burden that must weigh heavier with each passing year. Or it might be scattered among several people, a conspiracy of silence that protects family bonds at the expense of justice. We may never know. But the questions endure, echoing through the forests of the Vosges, waiting for someone, someday, to finally answer them. And so we're left with this. A 4-year-old boy who deserved to grow up, parents who deserved answers, a family that deserved peace, and a justice system that failed them all. The Gregory Villemin case stands as a reminder of how complicated truth can be, how family bonds can become chains, and how the simplest question, who did this, can remain unanswered for a lifetime. The Valognes River still flows through the Vosges, cold and steady, carrying its secrets toward the sea. Somewhere in those mountains, someone knows what really happened. And until they speak, Gregory Villemin's story remains unfinished, a mystery that haunts France to this day, a ghost that refuses to rest. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and subscribe, so you never miss the next true crime story to help you unwind. Now, let's get into our final story. Story 4. The death of Nicole Lee Hattamer. In the summer of 1995, a young woman walked out of her apartment in broad daylight and never came home. What happened in the hours that followed would haunt a small town for decades, not because of what was discovered, but because of what was never fully explained. Now, we're going to talk about a case that doesn't get mentioned much anymore. One that slipped quietly through the cracks of history, but left behind questions that still don't have clean answers. This is the story of Nicole Lee Hattamer, a name you might not recognize, a life that ended too soon, and a mystery that, even now, feels incomplete. So close your eyes if you'd like. Let the room grow still, and let me tell you what happened. Nicole Lee Hattamer was 23 years old in the spring of 1995. She lived in a small college town in the Midwest, one of those places where everyone knew everyone, where the main street had 2 traffic lights and a diner that served breakfast all day. It was the kind of town where people didn't lock their doors, where trust was assumed, not earned. Nicole had grown up there. She'd gone to the local high school, played clarinet in the band, worked summers at the ice cream shop on the corner. After graduation, she'd enrolled at the community college nearby, studying early childhood education. She wanted to be a teacher. She loved kids. Her friends described her as warm, reliable, the kind of person who remembered your birthday and showed up when you needed help moving furniture. She lived in a small apartment above a hardware store on Main Street. It wasn't much, just a bedroom, a kitchenette, a bathroom with a window that looked out over the alley. But it was hers. She worked part-time at the college library, shelving books and helping students find research materials. She had a routine. Mondays and Wednesdays were her long days. Fridays, she usually met her best friend, Carla, for pizza at the place near campus. Her life was quiet, predictable, safe, or so it seemed. There were small things, though. Things that didn't register as warnings at the time, but later, looking back, they felt different. Nicole had mentioned to Carla that someone had been calling her apartment and hanging up. It happened 3 or 4 times over the course of a few weeks. She brushed it off. Wrong number, probably. But Carla remembered the way Nicole's voice sounded when she talked about it. Not scared, exactly. Just unsettled. There was also the guy from her psychology class. His name was Derek. He'd asked Nicole out twice. Both times, she'd politely declined. She wasn't interested. She told Carla he seemed nice enough, but something about the way he looked at her made her uncomfortable. He'd linger after class, walk a little too close behind her in the hallway. Nothing she could point to as definitively wrong. Just a feeling. Derek didn't take the rejection well. He started showing up at the library where Nicole worked. He'd sit at a table near the front desk, pretending to study, but really just watching her. She mentioned it to her supervisor, who suggested she let them know if it continued. It did, but Nicole didn't want to make a big deal out of it. She didn't want to seem dramatic. That was Nicole. She gave people the benefit of the doubt. She didn't want to cause trouble. On the afternoon of June 14th, 1995, Nicole finished her shift at the library around 3 in the afternoon. She told her coworker she was heading home to change, then meeting Carla for an early dinner. She seemed fine, normal, maybe a little tired. It had been a long week, but nothing seemed off. She walked the 4 blocks back to her apartment. A few people saw her on the way. The owner of the hardware store downstairs waved as she passed. A neighbor saw her unlock the door to the stairwell that led up to her place. That was the last confirmed sighting of Nicole Lee Hattamer alive. When Nicole didn't show up to meet Carla that evening, Carla wasn't immediately worried. She waited at the restaurant for about 20 minutes, tried calling Nicole's apartment, no answer, and figured maybe something had come up. Nicole was reliable, but life happens. Carla went home, assuming she'd hear from her friend later. But the next morning, when Nicole didn't show up for her Saturday shift at the library, people started to notice. Her supervisor called her apartment. No answer. Called again an hour later. Still nothing. By that afternoon, Carla drove to Nicole's building. She knocked on the door. No response. She asked the hardware store owner if he'd seen her. He said no, not since yesterday afternoon. Carla had a bad feeling. She called Nicole's parents, who lived about 30 miles away. They hadn't heard from her either. That wasn't like Nicole. She called them every few days, at least. By Sunday morning, Nicole's father contacted the local police. They weren't overly concerned at first. She was an adult, after all, and she'd only been out of contact for a day and a half. But her father insisted. Nicole wouldn't just disappear. She wouldn't leave without telling anyone. The police agreed to do a welfare check. When officers arrived at Nicole's apartment, they found the door locked. They knocked, called out, got no response. The landlord was contacted. He came with a key. Inside, everything looked normal, neat even. Nicole's bed was made. Her purse was on the kitchen counter. Her keys were on the table by the door. Her wallet was inside the purse, cash and ID still there. The lights were off. The windows were closed. But Nicole wasn't there. The officers searched the small apartment thoroughly. Nothing seemed disturbed. No signs of a struggle. No signs of forced entry. It was as if she'd simply stepped out and never returned. Except she hadn't taken her keys. Or her purse. Or her wallet. That was when the situation shifted. Missing person reports were filed. Flyers went up around town. Carla and Nicole's family started calling everyone they could think of. Friends, classmates, co-workers. No one had seen her. No one had heard from her. The police began interviewing people. They talked to Nicole's co-workers at the library, her professors, her friends. They talked to Derek, the guy from her psychology class. He said he barely knew her, just a classmate. He seemed cooperative, if a little defensive. He had an alibi for the evening Nicole disappeared. He'd been at his parents' house, helping his dad with some yard work. His parents confirmed it. The investigation expanded. Police searched the area around Nicole's apartment, the campus, the nearby woods. They brought in search dogs. They checked hospitals, bus stations, anywhere she might have gone. Days passed, then a week, then 2. And then, on June 29th, 15 days after Nicole was last seen, a man walking his dog in a wooded area about 8 miles outside of town found something. It was a shoe, a woman's sneaker, white canvas worn at the toe. The man called the police. They searched the area, and about 50 yards deeper into the trees they found her. Nicole Lee Hattamer was lying face down in a shallow ravine, partially covered by leaves and branches. She was fully clothed. Her body was in an advanced state of decomposition, which made determining an exact cause of death difficult. But there were clear signs of trauma, bruising around her neck, injuries consistent with strangulation. The coroner later estimated she'd been dead for at least 10 days, possibly longer, which meant she'd likely been deceased shortly after she was last seen. The question was, how did she get there? The discovery of Nicole's body turned what had been a missing person case into a homicide investigation, and the police had very few leads. There was no evidence of struggle in her apartment, no witnesses who saw her leave, no sign that she'd been taken by force. Her car, a small sedan, was still parked behind her building, untouched. The autopsy revealed that Nicole had died from asphyxiation, likely due to manual strangulation. There were defensive wounds on her hands, scratches on her arms. She'd fought back, but whoever had done this had been stronger. There was no evidence of any form of inappropriate physical contact. No indication that robbery had been a motive. Her jewelry was still on her body when she was found. Detectives interviewed Derek again. This time, they pressed harder. His alibi checked out, but they weren't convinced. They looked into his background. No criminal record, no history of violence. But people who knew him said he could be intense, obsessive even. When he fixated on something or someone, he didn't let go easily. Still, they didn't have enough to charge him. No physical evidence linked him to the scene. No witnesses placed him with Nicole that day. The investigation stalled. Months went by, then a year. The case grew cold. Nicole's family held a memorial service. Carla graduated and moved away. The town tried to move on, but the questions lingered. Who had done this, and why? In 1997, 2 years after Nicole's death, a detective working on another case stumbled across something. A man named Thomas Ridley had been arrested for assault in a neighboring county. During questioning, he mentioned, almost offhandedly, that he'd been in Nicole's town around the time she disappeared. He'd been doing odd jobs, staying in a motel just outside the city limits. Detectives looked into it. Thomas had a record, theft mostly, a few assault charges. Nothing that matched the profile of Nicole's attacker exactly, but enough to raise suspicion. They brought him in. At first, he denied knowing anything about Nicole, but after several hours of questioning, his story started to change. He admitted he'd seen her once, maybe twice, around town. He didn't remember where. Then, finally, he said something that made the detectives sit up. He said he'd been in the woods that day, the same woods where Nicole's body was found. He'd been camping, he said, just passing through. They asked if he'd seen anything unusual. He paused, then said yes. He'd seen a car parked near the trailhead, a blue sedan. He couldn't remember the make, but he remembered it because it seemed out of place. And he'd seen a man, walking into the trees, alone. He couldn't describe the man in detail. Average height, maybe, dark hair. That was all. It wasn't enough, but it was something. Thomas Ridley was eventually cleared. His DNA didn't match anything found at the scene. His story, vague as it was, couldn't be corroborated. He drifted out of the investigation as quickly as he'd entered it. Derek, the man from Nicole's psychology class, was never charged. There was simply no evidence. He moved out of state a few years later. Whether he had anything to do with Nicole's death remains unknown. The case is still officially open, technically unsolved, but in practical terms, it's gone quiet. The detectives who worked it have retired. The files sit in storage somewhere, gathering dust. Nicole's family never got the answers they wanted. Her mother passed away in 2008. Her father still lives in the same house where Nicole grew up. He doesn't talk about the case much anymore, but people who know him say he never stopped looking for the truth. Carla, Nicole's best friend, became a teacher, the thing Nicole had always wanted to be. She named her first daughter Nicole. In 2012, a local journalist wrote a piece about the case, hoping to generate new leads. A few people called in tips, but nothing came of it. The article was shared online, discussed briefly, then forgotten. There are theories, of course. Some people still think it was Derek. Others think it was a stranger. Someone passing through town. Someone Nicole crossed paths with by terrible chance. Some think it was someone closer to her than anyone realized. A friend. A neighbor. Someone she trusted. The truth is, we don't know. And we may never know. What we do know is that Nicole Lee Hattamer was 23 years old. She loved kids. She wanted to be a teacher. She made people laugh. She remembered birthdays. And on a summer afternoon in 1995, someone took all of that away. Her story didn't end with justice. It ended with silence. But maybe, in telling it, we can keep her memory alive. We can remember that she was here, that she mattered, and that somewhere out there someone knows what happened. Thank you for watching and being part of this dive into the dark and fascinating stories that keep us all on edge. If you enjoyed the ride, remember to like, subscribe, and share with others who crave a good mystery. Tell us where you're watching from. I love knowing where in the world our true crime family is tuning in. Your presence means a lot. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and keep digging into the shadows where truth and mystery meet.